Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for joining. My name is Davina Gownden, and I'm one of the communications advisors here at RPRA, and I'll also be the moderator for today's session. Welcome to our webinar on the development of recycling efficiency rate calculation and verification procedures for batteries, ITTAV, lighting, and HSP. Before we begin, I just wanted to go over some housekeeping. This session will be recorded and the slides will also be available on RPRA's website later this week. An overview for today's webinar will provide an overview of all the procedures and will also be answering your questions. Please note that we'll be stopping at specific places in this webinar to answer your questions, but you may submit them at any time. Sydney, can you just go to the next slide, please? So to ask a question, there's a Q&A tab at the bottom of your screen. Please type in your question or your comment and click send. There is an upvote or a like button that you can press if you want to ask the same question. The way it works is there's a queue, and if you like the question, it'll be prompted to go to the top of the queue, so the question will be answered sooner. We will be trying to organize and respond to your questions that coincide to the topics that we're covering in the specific question or section. So if you notice that you've asked a question and it hasn't been answered, it may make sense to ask it at a later point in the presentation. So please don't worry about that too much. If we can't get to your question, or if you have a very specific question, please email us at consultations@rpra.ca. As a reminder, the session is being recorded and the slides will also be available on our website later this week. I'll now hand it off to Jonathan Peng, who will continue the presentation. Thank you.
Thanks, Davina, and thanks everybody who's able to join our today's webinar. My name is Jonathan. I'm the audit and risk lead from RPRA, working with Dillon to develop this procedure. I'm also joined by my colleague Barbara today to support this webinar. I'll be starting off by giving you some background information about this procedure development. Then I'm going to hand over to Dillon to go over the actual procedures. Dillon was retained by RPRA to develop the battery ITTAV lighting and hazardous material RER procedure. The purpose of developing this RER procedure is to refine the current audit verification procedure on the website and provide more clarities to processors to meet the recycle efficiency rate verification requirement. This consultation was separated into two phases. The first phase took place between March 7th to April 14th, 2023. RPRA and Dillon engaged with pros and processors to gather information about company's operation and to share some preliminary insights. We're now starting our second phase consultation to engage with broader stakeholder communities to get your feedback on our draft procedures, and you will have till November 24th, 2023 to submit your feedback. RPRA will consider feedback received when we finalizing the final procedure, and you will be notified when the final procedure is posted. Without further ado, I would like to hand over to Dillon to talk about the actual procedure.
Thank you so much, Jonathan. So before getting into the procedure itself, we will provide an overview again of the timeline and for the finalization of the procedure review, share with you some of the principles that we used in the procedure review, and then we will take you through the procedure in two parts. In part one, we will start by highlighting the major points that we heard during this initial phase that Jonathan already referred to, an interview stage. And we will detail how it was addressed in the procedure. And in part two, we will walk through the procedure itself step by step. I'm joined here by my colleagues, Sydney Baker and Rochelle Duchesne, and they will also, you will hear more from them in the second part of this webinar. So as Jonathan already mentioned, we started the development early this year. We did background research. We reviewed all the submitted verification reports. We engaged with subject matter experts and reviewed other relevant information sources. We had the interviews with pros and processors. We drafted procedures working with our subject matter experts and with RPRA to present to you today the draft procedures that we have. And today we're here specifically to talk about the batteries procedure. We will have webinars as well on November 6th and 8th to talk about the electronics, so the EEE and the HSP procedures. And we look forward to receiving your feedback on those procedures by November 24th. Now, moving forward, we are targeting early 2024 to finalize the consultation report and to finalize the procedures. And the reports, the RER reports final are due to RPRA by April 30th, 2024. So again, we look forward to receiving your feedback. As Davina already mentioned, you can do so during this webinar via the Q&A. You will also receive an email after this webinar, which will contain a survey, which you may complete anonymously or not. You can also send an email directly to consultations@repra.ca. REPRA will forward any relevant information to us for consideration in the finalization process and for the consultation report. With that, I would like to get into the principles that we used for the development of the procedures. So really to guide the development, we had a set of principles on which we already received feedback during the interview stage. And the main principles are outlined here. So we used the principle of reliability for the calculation of the RER. And what we mean by that is that the calculations should be reflective of the actual resource recovery as defined in the regulation. And secondly, it should be accurate within reason. Now, this second part is an important notion that we've received a lot of perspectives on. The way we interpret this, and especially the concept of reason, is that reasonability really considers the level of effort required to obtain accurate information in view of the actual risks and impacts of inaccuracy, and in view of the processor's actual potential influence over the information source and the source of inaccuracy. Secondly, calculations should be verifiable and auditable, meaning the calculation has to be standardized so that the outcomes of the calculations are comparable, reproducible, and fair. So next, for the verification, we use the principles of transparency and constructiveness. Transparency includes the reporting of significant positive and negative findings, while the principle of constructiveness recognizes that practices of data collection, management, tracking, sharing, these are areas that are really evolving, and the identification of areas for improvement should be included as part of the verification. As you consider the draft procedure, we would really appreciate to better understand how, in your view, these procedures align with the principles that we presented here. So with that, getting into part one, what we've heard during the initial phase, the phase one. And during these interviews, four main themes emerged across all three regulations, actually. And some of these considerations lay outside of the scope of the procedure review, but were considered essential in setting the context within which the procedures will be used. And these include the RER reporting responsibility, the balancing of the administrative burden with the risk and impact, the definition of recovered resources, and the access to downstream performance information. And I will go through each of these key themes, detailing what it is we have heard and how we address these in the procedures. So the first key consideration relates to the responsibility for the RER performance, which lies with the primary processor. And it was noted that the RER reflects the performance of the full recycling value chain, which is to a certain extent also influenced by the product design and by how materials are collected. However, primary processors are solely held responsible for the RER performance, while the influence over this performance spans the control over their own sales channels, commercial terms, design operation of their own recovery processes, etc. Finally, it was raised that the notion of primary processor itself is not defined in the regulation, and processors that are required to register and report do not all play the same role in the recycling supply chain. Now, how did we take this into account in the procedure development? The procedure does not change the regulation. So what the procedure does try to address is any unclarity in to whom the procedure applies. And we did so by providing definitions for the purpose of the procedure for processing, for preparing for processing, for primary and for a downstream processor. So we propose these definitions, with processing meaning the activities that alter the characteristics of materials that are derived from batteries for the purpose of resource recovery. Preparing for processing, meaning activities that are carried out prior to processing batteries, which would include sorting, blending, mixing, repackaging, consolidation, etc. So a person who only prepares materials for processing is not considered a battery processor. Now, a primary processor is the first person or facility that receives batteries used and collected in Ontario and processes these. And with that, a downstream processor is a person or facility that receives recoverable resources that were generated from batteries used and collected in Ontario from a battery processor for the purpose of further processing. Now, I just want to pause here because we introduced here a new concept, which is the concept of recoverable resource. And I'll talk a little bit more about that in the subsequent slides. So I'll hold your thoughts on that one. So for the downstream processing, we said all processing activities are considered in scope of this definition until the resources can be considered a recovered resource. And this will lead to the to another area that was much discussed, and we'll get to that in a couple of slides. But before we keep on going on the recovered resources, a lot of discussions were held around the balancing of the administrative burden with risk and impact. And this has everything to do with this principle of reliability, the accurate within reason. What does that mean? What is reasonable? We heard loud and clear that the RER verification represents a high cost and resource burden for processors, and that audit and verification scopes sometimes overlap. How we considered this in the procedure development is, or the options we considered were included the reduction of the RER verification frequency for low risk situations, And we consider the reduction of the overall effort of the calculation and the verification. And what you will find in the proposed version is that second option. Now, how we did that, we have reflected that in the description of the requirements for the verifier, which may be a first party. A first party meaning somebody who may be employed by the processor itself. Secondly, we for the sampling, we allow the verifier to consider other similar audits or similar scope that have been undertaken and adjust the sample size accordingly. Lastly, the reduction of the time frame over which the RER mass balance is to be calculated, which would impact the total population of the samples to review. In the proposed procedure, we have reduced the time frame to 2 consecutive quarters. And this is something that we would like to get your feedback on as well. So on the recovered resource definition, the RCA defines resource recovery as the extraction of useful materials or other resources from things that may otherwise be waste, including through reuse, recycling, reintegration, regeneration, or other activities. And this is a really broad definition, which can lead to a potential or creates a potential for inconsistency in calculating and reporting the RER. To address this, we have done a number of things. At least considered a number of options. The first option considered was, do we develop a list of which products or commodities can be recovered or not? So this was rejected as an option because it may vary on the supply chain. So you cannot say a particular commodity is always considered, be considered recovered if this is really eventually depending on the choice of the processor and may not consistently be applied. So this would conflict with the principle of reliability. The second option considered is to improve the guidance and provide additional clarity on really how to determine whether a resource can be considered recovered or not. And this is what we proposed. And we included 3 additional areas for guidance. So first, we included a new notion, additional definitions and a new notion. And this new notion was of a recoverable resource, which is understood to be a resource that is derived from batteries that are sent downstream to be further processed. We have also clarified what we mean by recovered resource, which is understood as a resource that is derived from batteries that will not undergo further refining and is used to displace a virgin material in the manufacturing or in the use of a new product. Now, the second thing we included in the procedures is additional guidance, including guidance on how to determine the downstream RER. I'll get to that in more detail in a second. Thirdly, we included examples of what we would consider a recoverable resource or a recovered resource. Next. Now, without going into too much detail on this graph, this is what we mean by additional calculation guidance, where there is a recognition of all of the potential material streams that enter the battery recycling process. and clear guidance on how this should be accounted for. I want to go into a little bit more detail here on the recovered resource side. So this being the nominator of the RER calculation, we are talking about a recovered resource as being the sum of the recovered resources that are generated directly by the processor, meaning that they fulfill the definition of a recovered resource, and added to that, the sum of all the recovered resources that are being produced at the end of the downstream supply chain. And those recovered resources can be determined by multiplying the downstream RER with the amount of material that was sent downstream, so the amount of recoverable resources produced by the processor. And this introduces this notion of the downstream RER. Now, this leads to the last key consideration is, how do we obtain access to this downstream performance information? And it was highlighted that this information is considered commercially sensitive, is not being willingly passed on in the supply chain, and processors may not be able to verify this information either. So what are the options that we considered to address this? The first option was to set a standard downstream RER for standardized commodity categories. The second option considered was for processors to obtain RER statements from downstream processors who then can self-declare their RER in line with the procedure. And the third option considered was to allow the downstream RER to be estimated by processors based on thermodynamic analysis. Now, I want to highlight that most of these options were already discussed in this phase one, and none actually really received very broad support. So what we would like to do today is to take you through the detailed advantages and disadvantages that we saw, and that leads to the current proposed version to contain the second option, but we would appreciate feedback on all three. So for the standard downstream RERs, this is a very low administrative burden, so that's an advantage. However, similar to definition of what is a recovered resource by just tying that to the commodity type, a standard downstream RER also ignores differences between processor and their supply chains. Also, there is actually a lack of really standardized categories for and specifications for commodities that are being generated at the processing stage. So developing this is both difficult and may not actually meet our align with the principles. Next one. So the RER self-declaration advantage is that it aligns with existing practice in some supply chains. But the disadvantage is that downstream processors may not be responsive to the request from a processor to give them and declare their RER. And this is especially the case when these processors represent a really small amount of their feedstock. The second disadvantage is that it may actually be quite difficult for a downstream processor to determine their RER if the amount of feedstock that they receive from a processor is small and is part of a very wide variety of feedstocks. So on the third option, the thermodynamic analysis, starting with the disadvantages, it has to be recognized that theoretical analysis is always going to result in a higher RER than is actually achievable in practice operationally. It's often under ideal circumstances. It is not considering the actual operational realities of a process. It may, in some cases, not even reflect the actual design, as processors may not have sufficient information on the details of the downstream process. So we know that theoretical analysis is not going to be highly accurate and is going to be overestimating the yields. However, there's also advantages, because theoretical analysis could give a better idea of a yield, or maybe in some cases we have heard the only a very achievable way of calculating the yield of a recoverable resource stream, in case this is a very small portion of a total diverse feedstock that enters into a joint final product. So in those cases, is this something that should be considered? Should it be considered on a case-by-case basis? And if yes, under what conditions? If that is the case, it would at least lower the administrative burden in subsequent years, understanding that in the first year to actually perform that analysis would be quite some effort. So with that, getting to what we would much appreciate to hear from you, specifically on the recovered resources, we would like to hear from you if the proposed options really sufficiently increase the clarity on how to determine the weight of recovered resources, and whether the proposed options really represent the best approach according to you, and reflect this principle of accuracy within reason. Now, for the second part, and this actually applies to all the key considerations, all these 4 themes that we've just discussed. To address these considerations, did we overlook any option? For the options that we proposed in these draft procedures, were any considerations overlooked? And we are especially eager to hear from you whether you think there are any specific challenges that we should anticipate with the approaches as presented and proposed. And with that, I think it is time for opening the floor for some questions and answers.
Yes, that's correct. I don't see any in the Q&A box right now, but we'll give folks a few minutes to type their questions out, and then we'll see if we can answer some. Okay, so I'm not seeing any questions being put in, so I think Tessa, feel free to continue. And if folks have questions while Tessa's going through the presentation, please continue to put them in the Q&A tab, and we will get to them when we stop for the next set of question time. Thank you. Please proceed.
Thanks, Davina. I will actually like to pass the floor to Sydney Baker, who's going to be continuing this presentation.
Right, happy to be here. And so now what we're going to do now is we're going to get into the actual proposed procedure. And within the proposed procedure, these are the sort of high-level elements that there are. There's definitions, and then there's calculation guidance, verification guidance, and then we have the two appendixes with the sampling methodology as well as the methodology for verifying methodologies. Sorry. So I'm going to go through the calculations. The definitions, as you've already seen a lot of them presented by Tessa, and a few of them will come up throughout the rest of the presentation as well. And then I'll hand it off to Rochelle to go through the verification and appendix. So within the calculation of the RER, we're going to go through the two methods that we propose for determining the RER, some general guidance around calculating the RER, the formula itself, and then how you determine the weight of batteries received for processing, and how you determine the weight of recovered resources, including the determination of the downstream RER. So within the procedure, we contemplate two different approaches for processors to use to determine their RER. The first is the mass balance calculation, and this one would be the expectation for most processors. And the mass balance calculation really looks at the total weight of materials received and processed within a specified time frame. And as the name suggests, doing a mass balance calculation of weight in and weight out, and within that determining the RER. The mass balance approach needs to be verified by someone meeting the requirements in the procedure, and it would need to be completed annually. And then the field test approach would be used only by those for who they couldn't do the mass balancing approach. So that might be a downstream processor who can't obtain the information required to attribute the process performance to a particular primary processor. So maybe, as Tessa mentioned, the feedstock of materials coming from a certain primary processor isn't enough to determine their RER, or hard to separate from their other materials. So the field test would be based on a field, like a specific run of the process, and it would be done under the supervision of a person meeting the requirements in the procedure. So that means that unlike the mass balance, which is verified at the end, the field test needs to be done under the supervision of someone with the capacity to verify that it's being set up in a way that's going to yield an accurate RER. And then it would be completed at the interval that's the lowest of once every 3 years, or when there's a material change to the process or feedstock. So just on the general guidance, RER has to be calculated for each facility. If you're using a scale, it needs to be calibrated, and weights within the calculation should be taken from that calibrated scale. And then we've also put in here an allowance that if non-designated materials are identical in composition to designated batteries, they can be included in the calculation of the RER. And so examples here of something that would be identical could be batteries that are sourced from outside Ontario, or batteries that weigh more than 5 kg, but are identical to designated batteries that were sourced inside Ontario or weigh less than 5 kg. So it is very important that the materials, non-designated materials, are identical, and that would have to be verified as well. So here we have the actual formula that would be used to calculate the RER. So essentially R on top is the weight of recovered resources, and it's going to be divided by the total weight of materials and any added materials to the process, and then we're going to multiply by 100% to get the percentage. Within the mass balancing approach, these weights are going to be derived from all batteries received during that processing time frame. So as explained by Tessa, that's going to be 2 consecutive quarters. And with the field test, all these weights are going to be derived from the weight of materials that are run through that specific field test. So that's the difference here. And then Here, I'll just go over again, so these definitions of preparing for processing versus processing. So when we're determining the weight of batteries received for processing, this is really going to be the preparation for processing phase. So this is when we are sorting out non-designated materials. We're sorting out batteries that are going to be sent for refurbishing or reuse. So at this stage, that's what is really happening, is the preparation for processing. And you'll see that here in this process flow. So you'll see on the left-hand side, there's an opening inventory, and then there's the weight of materials received from haulers. Those together are the total weight of inbound materials that a facility would receive. And then it's going to go into the pink box in the center, which is actually preparing the materials for processing. So as you can see, you're removing non-designated materials, any batteries sent for processing at a different facility. There's also space there for a closing inventory, so if batteries aren't processed during the time frame, and then batteries sent for refurbishing or for reuse. And once all those materials are removed, that's where you get your total weight, which is going to be one of the inputs to the formula to calculate the RER. And here we just wanted to highlight, so we have created a mass balance template, and this is a tool that goes along with the procedure and to assist processors in the calculation of RER. I'm not going to go through it in detail at this point. We just want you to know that it does exist and it's there as a resource to be used to sort of facilitate the RER calculation. And within the procedure where the mass balance template applies, we've referred to the steps, referring to which steps need to be completed at each step of the calculation. So the determination of the weight received for the field test approach is really quite straightforward. It's just going to be the weight of the feedstock used to run the test. So the expectation there would be that anything non-designated would already be removed. And this is really going to be the weight of batteries that are going to be run through the field test. And in the verification section, we'll talk about the requirements for the feedstock composition a little bit further. So now that we've got the total weight, the TW, the next thing that needs to be determined is the weight of recovered resources. So as Tessa went through, there's the two definitions, recoverable resources and recovered resource. So again, the recoverable resources is going to be sent to a downstream processor for further processing. And the recovered resource is going to be used to displace a virgin material in the manufacturing of a new product. So these examples are provided within the procedure of recoverable and recovered resources. And this isn't meant to be an exhaustive list, but it is meant to help processors understand which would be recoverable or recovered. And that brings us to a consultation question that we do have, and that's whether there are any other additional examples of recovered or recoverable resources that you feel should be added. And if yes, if you could identify those for us. I'm not going to pause here, but if you want, at the end of the presentation, we're going to have some more time for QA. We'd be happy to hear examples from you. I'll just note that as in the procedures as well, there's some additional information about outbound materials that includes a few more examples of recovered and recoverable resources. So you can have a look at those as well when considering feedback on this question. So to determine the weight of recovered resources, this is the process flow that's we're working with. So on the left-hand side, you have the total weight of batteries received, and they're going to go into the processing stage. And then during processing, we recognize that in some cases, materials will be added to the process, and then they'll be incorporated into the outbound materials. So any materials that are added to the process would be included in the RER calculation. And then the outputs from processing are unrecoverable materials that would not count towards the RER. So that includes materials that are landfilled, incinerated, used as fuel or a fuel supplement, or deposited on land. And it's also going to include any process losses. So that might be evaporated water, for example. The other outputs are recovered resources. So those are recovered resources directly from the processor's process. And then the recoverable resources that are going to be sent downstream and then turned into recovered resources. So here, this is the actual formulas for determining the recovered resources. So as shown in the first formula there, the total weight of recovered resources is going to be the weight of recovered resources from the battery processor, as well as the weight of recovered resources from the downstream processors. And when we're determining that downstream processor's weight of recovered resources, we're going to use the weight of recovered resources sent to that processor specifically, and that processor's specific downstream RER. So it's important that when you're doing this calculation, that materials are grouped by the next destination, and they're grouped by each processor and multiplied by the downstream RER. So again, outbound materials are going to be recovered resources, recoverable resources, or unrecoverable materials. And they have to be summed in groups corresponding to their next processing or disposal destination when doing these calculations. And also just to note that for a material to be considered recovered or recoverable, the processor has to be able to demonstrate a basis for that allocation. So that might be a proof of sale, or a proof of sale to a manufacturer or to a downstream processor. And then again, for the determination of the downstream RER, the expectation would be that they would follow the calculation guidance in the procedure. So they would be following either the mass balancing or the field test approach. And then the downstream processor would provide a letter to the processor determining their RER that includes a statement of the RER facility that the materials were sent to, a list of the products, and a statement of the average yield for targeted materials. And sorry, at the beginning, the RER of the facility, and then a signature of the site manager or equivalent. So the downstream RER is going to be determined by each downstream processor using the mass balance or field test approach. And then this also, just to note, the recovered resource, so this process keeps going until a material is turned into a recovered resource. So if a downstream processor sends materials to a further downstream processor, it's important that the downstream processor gets the RER from that further downstream processor to determine their own RER. So this process keeps going until there is a recovered resource, as defined in the recoverable and recovered resource definitions. And just again here, I'll just quickly put up these definitions. So who do these procedures apply to? So the primary processor is that first facility, and then the downstream processor is everybody up until all processing activities are considered in scope until the resource can be considered a recovered resource. And then again here, I just want to highlight that we have the mass balance template, and it goes through this piece of the procedure as well for determining the R. And it includes, you put in the weight of recovered resources, recoverable resources sent to each processor, and then you'll put in their RER, and it'll calculate the weight of recovered resources for each of those processors, and then calculate the total RER, the total R. So just highlighting that this tool has been created and exists for processors to use when going through this process. Now I'm going to hand it over to Davina quickly and for a poll.
Hi, everyone. We're going to take a quick break and launch a poll just to get some feedback on how we can improve our consultations. It's 4 quick questions, and then we'll continue with the rest of the procedure and the presentation. So you should see it on your screen now. I'll leave it up for about 60 seconds. And then, as I said, we'll continue with the presentation. I'll leave it up for a few more seconds. Okay, perfect. Thank you so much. Please continue.
All right. So thank you, Sydney. My name is Rochelle. I'm going to take over for the next section. We're going to discuss the verification of the RER. So this includes some general guidance, and then we're going to talk about how you verify the actual mass balance calculation that Sydney was just talking about. And then I'm going to go into a bit more detail on the field test approach as well. Next slide, please. So first off is the verifier and field test verifier credentials. So for facilities that are within Canada, the request is that the verifier is going to be a licensed engineer. So that's someone that holds a license. That could be a limited license, temporary, just anything that's under the Professional Engineers Act, or equivalent if you're in a different province within Canada. And then for facilities abroad, there's 3 different criteria that your verifier needs to have. And that's either a master's degree in engineering or of science, relevant to the facility, and 3 years of experience, or a bachelor's degree, again, engineering or science, that's relevant with 5 years of experience. The last point is a verification certification. Again, that's relevant to your procedure. The other requirement for verifiers is that they physically toured the facility and they have enough of an understanding of the process to be able to check any assumptions or look at any errors or omissions and analyze the data system that you use for collecting your information. So for material error thresholds, we've broken it down into qualitative and quantitative errors, the quantitative being a value that exceeds 5% of your total weight that's processed. And then qualitatively, that's just if your verifier sees anything that is of concern, whether that's a control issue that makes them kind of question the reported data, or if you're not able to locate some information that they've requested, or if there's just some non-compliance in anything that's indirectly related to the RER regulation. And then for this next part, this is just a general overview of the verification execution procedure. So the verification process is going to involve these 4 steps. So assessing the relevance and transparency and sources of your data. And then the second part is if there's options for what methodology or equation you could use, just to kind of see if there's adequate justification for which one you've selected. And then checking whether any assumptions in the data that you've provided is justified. And the fourth is if there's anywhere where they require more elaboration or research or explanation on something, to identify those things. And then just to get into a bit more detail on the verification procedure, there's 3 steps. So step A has probably the most details, but we're going to break them down step by step. So the first one here is step A, so data and calculation verification. We have 8 steps for the verifier to follow, which you can read through, but includes the weight of inbound, outbound materials, unprocessed batteries, recoverable materials. It also includes calculating your downstream RER, your mass balance, and recalculating the RER. And I also missed the weight of materials that you're excluding, so any packaging or garbage, things like that. And then the next slides, we're going to get into details on points 2 and 3 a bit further. So for point 2, those materials that you're excluding also includes batteries of a different chemistry. These 4 subpoints, so A through D, are similar for a few of the points we discussed in the previous slide, but the one we want to verify or highlight here is verifying your inputs. So if there's any inputs for the materials you're excluding that are estimated through some sort of composition study, the verifier is just to assess that methodology in accordance with Appendix B, which we're going to talk about later. But if you're measuring those amounts, just to verify the calibration log of the scale. And then for point 3, the thing that we want to highlight here is just to verify your data points with your bills of lading or manifests. So this can include the weight of each sample that's on there, categorization, whether it's a recoverable or unrecoverable material, and then the destination. So if the business you're sending things to is legitimate, what's the type of any hazardous materials, things of the sort. So this next step is for your RER statement. So once you've verified all the things we just discussed, you're going to have that statement that considers, do you have enough evidence? Were there any material misstatements along the way? Does it conform with the calculation requirements? And are there any changes compared to prior reporting periods for that same facility? And then step C is the verification report. So we've got which sections to include in this report. So there's 9 of them. You're going to describe who your verifier is and what their competencies are to assess your facility, what the scope of the verification was, your sampling methodology. You're going to assess what the data management system and controls were like. And you're going to have the summary of your RER calculation, summary of any assumptions you made along the way, summary of any errors. So if there's anything you come across that's within those materiality thresholds we discussed, you're going to put a recommendation for a corrective action alongside that. And then you're going to have your verification statement that has your RER percentage, and then the review declaration, which is acknowledged by the site manager for that facility. Another new request here is that the reports be more than 5,000 words in length. So then this slide, it's a little tiny, but if you can kind of see the different steps, it's another part of that mass balance template that Sydney had shown before. And so we've got steps 5 through 8 here, step 5 being your recycling efficiency rate, and then the next step being unrecoverable materials, next one being your closing inventory, and then the final step being your mass balance. So then the last bit we're going to talk about before the 2 appendices is the field test. So Sydney had touched on it a bit before, but we're just going to get into detail about what that field test plan is. So prior to actually running your field test, you're going to have to create this field test plan with your verifier. That includes a number of things. The first thing is the feedstock composition. So your feedstock has to be representative of what an average sample is going to look like in your facility for that test specifically. And then on the next slide, there's a couple more things you need to include in that plan. So the operational settings during your test have to be representative of a normal operating condition, and same with your batch size. That field test plan is going to have to be signed off by the field test verifier as well as your facility manager. Following the field test, you're going to create a verification report. Certain things are similar to the mass balance method. So you're going to talk about why your field test verifier is competent to perform the verification, what your process was like, and then a summary of your calculation. And then the additional thing that's different from the mass balance methodology is that you're also going to explain why you weren't able to use that mass balance methodology and why you're opting to do the field test instead. Some additional things you're going to include in that field test verification report are a list of your outbound materials. So this is any materials you're sending out within the last 12 months. So that could be multiple locations. And then the field test plan is going to be included as an appendix to that report. You're going to have a verification statement from the field test verifier confirming the RER. And then similar to the mass balance, you're going to have a review declaration from the facility manager. And the last 2 points we're going to talk about here are Appendix A is the sampling methodology, and Appendix B is the methodology verification. So this just gives a bit of guidance as to what size sample to do. So we're recommending that at least 50% of your total inbound and outbound loads from the facility is going to be your sample size. This can change depending on if you have multiple inbound and outbound sources, which is that second point there. And then the third point, we discussed how this is what is considered a recommended sample size. And I think Sydney or Tessa touched on it before, but if your verifier considers your facility in similar circumstances and that the percentage should be lower, they can make that call at their discretion. And then the final slide for me is Appendix B, methodology verification. This is for your field test. So this is just the a bit more detail on what to consider for the field test supervisor. Make sure the methodology is appropriate for your process. The methodology should be reflective of your feedstock average. You should make sure that the inputs are within that time frame that the RER is being calculated, and that the methodology is updated if there's any relevant process changes. And then just the same slide we had previously where you can put your input, and I will hand it back to RPRA.
Yes, this is another opportunity to get your questions answered. I don't see any in the tab right now, but please feel free to type them in and we can answer. So I'll wait for a couple of minutes, give folks a chance to type their question. Okay, looks like there aren't any questions at the moment. If you do have any questions, please email us at consultations@rpra.ca, and Dylan will be sending out an email survey as well. I'll hand it back to your team to give our closing remarks.
Thank you so much, Davina. Thanks everyone for attending the webinar today. Again, we look forward to receiving your feedback, preferably by November 24th. And thank you so much for your time. And with that, I would like to close this session today.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.